Approximately 19 miles away from Budapest, there was an estate of a wealthy Hungarian noble family, the Brunswick family. They initially owned a one-story mansion built in the Baroque style, which was later reconstructed into this two-story castle. About 200 years ago, Ludwig van Beethoven used to visit them as a guest. He would come from Vienna to relax. Nowadays, the journey from Vienna takes about 2.5 hours by car, but during Beethoven's time, of course, the trip lasted much longer. It is in this castle that a room has been preserved where Beethoven used to stay and where, according to experts, he composed one of his most famous and, in a sense, most unknown works, Piano Sonata No. 14, a sonata in the style of a fantasy, as he called it, or as we also call it, the Moonlight Sonata. When I said that this sonata is unknown, I meant that many people, while listening to the sonata, do not discover its deep meaning and perceive it superficially, following the picture of a moonlit night imposed by the title. It is important to note that the name Moonlight Sonata was not given by the composer but appeared after Beethoven's death, and unfortunately it stuck to this composition, overshadowing, sadly, the true content of the music for many people. Indeed, it is difficult to argue. The uniform rocking of the middle voice creates a sensation of small waves. The bright notes of the melody resemble moonlight. And there you have the picture, a moonlit night by the lake. This picture was imagined and permanently attached to Beethoven's sonata by the well-known poet and music critic of that time, Ludwig Heiligenstadt. He gave this title to the sonata after Beethoven's death, and in the end, Mr. Heiligenstadt is not to blame. It was his opinion about the meaning of the sonata. But then, humanity gladly started calling and, most importantly, perceiving it that way. But this is no longer Heiligenstadt's problem. Let's read some reviews about the sonata on the internet. This music is peaceful and beautiful. This music is healing for my soul. It brings me tranquility and relaxation. I find solace in this song, thank you. I do all my exercises to this melody, and so on. But here's an example of a different perspective. I say this with irony because a 3-year-old listener knows nothing about this music, not even Beethoven's name, let alone the words like sonata, etc. So, who is right? The grown-ups who exercise, relieve stress, and relax to this music, or the 3-year-old boy? And the next segment of our journey is a bit of history. Ludwig Beethoven is 22 years old. he arrives in Vienna to settle permanently. His small hometown of Bonn, with only about 10,000 inhabitants, is behind him, and ahead of him is the capital of Austria, with around 150,000 residents. In Bonn, his family remains. His two younger brothers, that's how they look in the biopic about Beethoven, and his father. His alcoholic father and his younger brothers were supported by Ludwig for many years after their mother's death. But now the brothers have grown up, they can earn a living for themselves, and their father receives a pension as a former singer in the court chapel. Ludwig dreams of taking composition lessons from none other than Haydn, who has already heard the music of the young composer and promised to work with him, help him with accommodation, and with money. Being a student of Haydn meant open doors to Vienna's musical salons. Vienna holds the status of the musical capital of Europe. Well-known musicians live and work here. There are many patrons, concerts take place, even operas are staged. In other words, the 22-year-old Beethoven came to conquer Vienna, and he conquered it quite easily. With his uniqueness, he was different, unlike anyone else. He was so audacious, young. Rumors about the extraordinary new student of the old Haydn spread quickly, and the hosts of high society musical salons sought to have Beethoven for just an evening. The stocky man with the appearance of a porter playing like an angel of God. He often played, they say, even not hitting the right notes, but with such emotion, he broke the pianos, those delicate Viennese forte pianos, with his intensity. And the Viennese audience, on one hand, they were shocked, but on the other hand, this freshness and uniqueness incredibly attracted them. Even Haydn once told him, "Young man, there's too much of you. It seems like you have 3 heads, 3 hearts. I mean, there's so much of everything, and you're not restrained enough." And that's why they parted ways. Although Beethoven, of course, had immense respect for Haydn, and Haydn acknowledged the incredible talent of the young man. During his 10 years in Vienna, by the time Beethoven turned 32, which is the peak of his life, he had a successful career. Students, commissions for compositions, his music being performed and loved, performed as a pianist, as a conductor. But at the same time, he reaches a state of despair to the point where he even contemplates suicide. And the cause of his depression is his increasing hearing loss. At first, he thought it was just a result of a cold, and that would soon recover. But the recovery never happened. Doctors couldn't help him. They prescribed herbal infusions, mineral baths. Years passed and the hopes dwindled. And gradually, he came to realize that deafness awaited him. Fate struck at the very core of his being, at his most precious gift, which he cherished dearly, his phenomenal hearing. Now, he wouldn't be able to perform, he wouldn't be able to conduct, he wouldn't be able to teach. And how would he make a living? With what means? He was also deprived of the joy of human communication. He couldn't even ask his interlocutor every time, "Speak louder, I can't hear anything." Beethoven started to be ashamed of himself. He became unsociable, even losing contact with many close friends. In 1802, a pivotal moment in his life, Beethoven heeds the advice of doctors and leaves Vienna for the village of Heiligenstadt. He seeks silence to give rest to his hearing and solitude to understand how to live on. It is there that he writes a letter to his brothers. This letter is his testament, and he is only 32. He candidly tells his brothers, and perhaps the whole world, about the agony he is going through. Just a little more, and I would have put an end to my life. Only one thing held me back: art. It seemed unthinkable to leave this world before I fulfilled everything that I felt destined to accomplish. Such depths of despair. But there, in Heiligenstadt, Beethoven finds acceptance. He is ready to drink the cup of suffering to the last drop. He embraces his deafness. Although complete deafness doesn't immediately set in, he could still hear if someone shouted into his ear. But upon returning to Vienna from Heiligenstadt, it can be said that a different Beethoven had returned. He accepts his deafness, and he is not broken. He continues to work, continues to compose music. That is why the title of our musical journey is The Return. It is about Beethoven's return to himself, to his purpose, to his art. And now I need to introduce to you the main heroine of my story, the charming Giulietta Guicciardi, the very woman to whom we owe the existence of the Moonlight Sonata. She burst into his life unexpectedly, a young provincial countess who arrived in the Austrian capital from Italy with her family in 1800. It was 2 years before Beethoven's departure to Heiligenstadt, before he wrote his testament. This is how she looks in portraits by artists. And this is how filmmakers who have made numerous films about the unfulfilled love of Ludwig and Giulietta imagine her. She is 17 years old. She captivated the composer at first sight. Soon, she expressed a desire to take lessons from the idol of the Viennese aristocracy. And, of course, he couldn't resist. He started giving the girl piano lessons, completely free of charge. Giulietta liked Beethoven for his popularity and even his eccentricities. He didn't take money from her, and she would give him shirts under the pretext of personally embroidering them for him. And Giulietta became the straw for which Beethoven grasped with all his might. He felt that she reciprocated his feelings. Beethoven once again felt a surge of strength and hope for recovery. Happiness was within reach. Now I go out more often. This change was brought about by a sweet, charming girl who loves me and whom I love, writes Ludwig to his friend. And further, you must see me happy. I will grab destiny by the throat. It won't be able to bend me completely. How wonderful it is to live a thousandfold life. Beethoven is filled with joy and bright hope. But soon, a rival appeared, young Count Robert von Gallenberg. Beethoven is 32 while he is 20. He also composes music and even seems brilliant to Giulietta. Eventually, she leaves Ludwig for Count Gallenberg. They soon marry and move to Italy. In a letter to Beethoven, Giulietta writes that her Count Robert von Gallenberg needed more support as a budding composer than Ludwig did. And that is the reason for her departure. After this breakup, Beethoven, literally crushed and in a state of despair, goes to Heiligenstadt, but we have already discussed this. Moonlight Sonata, published in 1802, was created under the immense pressure of the heaviest circumstances in Beethoven's life: impending deafness, a breakup with his beloved, loneliness, and a dark and unpredictable future. Here is the cover of the first edition of the sonata and its actual title: Sonata in the style of a fantasy for the harpsichord or piano. Composed and dedicated to the young Countess Giulietta by the composer Luigi van Beethoven. Luigi is the translation of the German name Ludwig. Composition 27, number 2, published in Vienna by Copy and Company. We often talk and contemplate about the impact that a work of art has on us, but we rarely think about whether a work of art influences its creator. I have the feeling that while composing the Moonlight Sonata, Beethoven wrote this music, saving himself from despair, listening, contemplating, and looking into it as a mirror, conducting a kind of psychotherapy session for himself through his music, speaking in contemporary language. The sonata consists of 3 movements. The main conflict is laid in the first movement. By the end of the third movement, as in a novel or a film or a theatrical play, the conflict should somehow be resolved. And now we are about to embark on the secret paths of the Moonlight Sonata, to find in it familiar yet unfamiliar territories, and I am confident that we will discover that the Moonlight Sonata is not at all moonlit. The first movement of the sonata starts with a brief introduction, only 30 seconds of music, just 5 measures. They are marked in pink. The introduction in music often serves as a preparation for the emergence of the main melody and may not attract much attention. It plays the role of an entrance hall before entering the main musical space. However, despite its brevity, the introduction in Moonlight Sonata actually plays an important role in developing the dramatic atmosphere. It serves as a prelude, evoking a sense of impending tragedy or disaster. Let's carefully listen to this introduction. Pay special attention to the third measure. In this measure, the feeling we mentioned arises, the feeling as if the ground disappears beneath our feet, the heart tightens, and the blood cools down. This sense of sudden fear or anticipation of disaster arises thanks to very unusual chords sounding in this third measure. These chords appear almost foreign and open up a black void before us. Let's listen once again to these sounds, and once again be amazed at the Beethoven precision of this musical cardiogram that reveals not the electrical state of the human heart, but its emotional and spiritual state. These mere 30 seconds of music may seem like nothing, but so much is said that one could describe an entire life. The introduction is an immortalized moment of human experience in music, a moment of feeling and realization of tragedy. In other words, the introduction, these few measures, are not a preparation for the future main part, but already the main part itself. And then the melody emerges. But before we talk about it, let's recall some punctuation marks that help to express thoughts more accurately. They are, by the way, universal in different languages. For example, the question mark. Our voice goes up. The period, on the contrary, represents an assertion and the voice goes down. The ellipses indicates an unfinished thought, conveying uncertainty, and our intonation lingers on the same note. Now, let's listen carefully to the melody of the first movement. The sequence of intonations, uncertainty, question, affirmation. This is how we solve problems in life. Uncertainty is the initial reaction to a problem. It's the beginning of the journey. Then comes the question, which represents an active state. The search for an answer, for a solution. And finally, the answer itself. Listen to how this sequence of our thoughts and feelings sounds in Beethoven's music. This tense process of searching for a solution, with variations of recurring intonations of uncertainty, questions, and answers, is the content of the first part of the sonata, rather than contemplating a scene of a lake sleeping under the moonlight. You can feel how Beethoven, by listening to his own composition, searches for ways out of a difficult situation, seeks solutions to the problems that have arisen in his life. But there is another element in this music, perhaps even more important than melody. It's rhythm. It is the movement of the music with triplets. On the count of 3. You might think that there's nothing particularly special about counting to 3, so why is it so important? Imagine yourself walking down the road and counting in your head. 1, 2. You feel that walking to the count of 2 is easy and natural. 1, 2, 1, 2. But if you start counting to 3, suddenly you won't be able to walk so easily anymore. Counting to 3 hinders your movement. Counting to 3 restricts and stops you. In the music of this section, the triplets never stop for a moment. You are constantly in a state of suspense. The repetitive motif of triplets acts like loops, entangling you and not allowing you to move forward. Behind the deceptive sense of tranquility lies the impossibility of movement, the inability to go on. Let's recall now the famous French sculptor Auguste Rodin and his remarkable sculpture, The Thinker. At first glance, the calm state of the contemplative person turns out to be just a superficial impression. For example, it's impossible to sit calmly like the thinker does. He leans forward as if ready to stand up at any moment. The hand on which he seems to casually rest his head is supported by the opposite leg, which is actually very uncomfortable. Sitting in such tension is only possible if the tension of thought is even stronger than the tension of muscles. Therefore, beneath the apparent calmness, there lies a balance of conflicting forces, physical force and the force of mental tension, and this balance can explode at any moment. It's the same in the sonata. Despite the external stability of the music, there is an intense internal conflict. It's also ready to explode. However, this doesn't happen in the first movement, and that is why the conflict remains unresolved and seems to be unresolvable at all. The second movement of the sonata is very unexpected at first glance. Wikipedia states, whether you believe it or not, that this part is considered the least popular by many. Most people mainly recognize the first and the third movements.
Basically, no one knows what the second movement sounds like. It's not famous at all.
At first, I really didn't like this movement. I thought the melody kind of borders on being cliché. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and it's just repeated a bunch of times.
Some call this part a mere respite before the powerful, menacing, and untamed third movement, while others explain the meaning of this music as a portrayal of the young Giulietta Guicciardi, carefree and even frivolous. Franz Liszt, an outstanding composer and pianist, whose words we must take very seriously, said that the second movement is like a small flower between two abysses. If we follow all these ideas, it turns out that the second movement somehow falls out of the logic of development of the whole composition. It's a thing in itself. But I am convinced that, on the contrary, it is the most important part of the sonata. It holds the key to the third movement. Without this second part, there would be no such third. After the suppression of the first movement, after that endless inner conflict, the transition to the volitional, crushing, courageous, decisive third movement would be impossible without this little key. The key should not be large, actually. It just should open the door. That is the purpose of the key, and the second movement opens the door. It releases the indomitable power of a person who has found the meaning of their life. It serves as the medicine that Beethoven prescribed for himself, This music is a psychotherapy session, a stage of self-suggestion, reprogramming of his state. When I say that a work of art affects its creator, I mean precisely the second movement of the sonata. I believe that when the idea of making the second movement came to Beethoven, exactly as he composed it, he felt relieved. He himself understood where to move forward, both in the music of the sonata and in his own life. The title of this story, The Return, is about Beethoven's return to himself, to finding the highest meaning in life. The sonata was composed during a turning point in Beethoven's life, from despair to heroism. And thanks to his genius, that psychotherapy session he intended for himself became a psychotherapy session for us as well. It became an important example of how to overcome depression and despair. The connection between the first and second movements is a connection by contrast. It is a transformation and rethinking of what was said in the beginning. Let's start with the first and most obvious element that is transformed, the tonality. The minor tonality of the first part, sad and gloomy, with just one important genetic switch, becomes the opposite, clear and happy major. It is not a change just from any minor to any major, but a change from a minor to the same key, major. It's like the same place in darkness and in light, or the same landscape at night and in the rays of the rising sun. The second important element that is transformed here in the second movement is the count by three. It's very interesting here. The second movement has also the count by three, but here it has acquired playfulness and entirely changed its emotional state from negative to positive. Instead of a monotonous, unceasing, constraining rhythm of triplets, we have a cheerful rhythm with bouncy pauses and funny unexpected accents and stops, something like 19th century jazz. Another element of contrast, the third already, the melody. At the beginning of this sonata, the melody has a series of ellipses, a feeling of endless tries to come to satisfying answers through long and painful questions. In the second movement, there's nothing like that. It's a chain of simple and direct questions and immediate, predictable, and clear answers. No long and painful reflections, no uncertainty. And another contrast, the entire musical form of the second movement is a complete opposite to the first. The first sounds more like a constant flow, like the process of seeking answers has no end. The second movement built on repetitions, no agonizing searches, full predictability and full clarity. As we can see, the second movement, this kind of psychotherapy session, provides a new perspective on all the problems stated at the beginning of the sonata. It helps reinterpret them and see the ways to overcome them. And now, the last, third movement of the sonata. It is a huge flow of energy. It's denial of the feeling of suppression and constraint in the first movement. It may seem that this flow of energy would turn into chaos, an uncontrollable element, but in reality, and this is very significant, it is ordered and organized. Of all three movements, the most complex and dynamic form is found here, the sonata form. It consists of different melodies, united in a logical and strict structure, merged into such a colossal living crystal. And that's why the outpouring of energy in this part does not create an image of destructive force, but rather a controlled force, a predictable force, a calculated force, that is, a force of meaning and will. This music creates the image of a person who has taken fate into their own hands. You can imagine the magnitude of this sound stream if you compare the lengths of the first and third movements. The first movement has only about 70 measures of music, while the third movement, which is almost the same length in terms of time, has 270 measures, and each measure is packed with a huge energy. Imagine how much its density, speed, and power have grown. The melodies of the third part are melodies of exultation in struggle and a premonition of victory. In these melodies, there's courage, grandeur, and freedom. And although the third movement is written in a minor key, like the first part, this minor reflects the tension, ecstasy, and rapture of the struggle, not suppression and constraint. The entire composition of the sonata, all its three movements, is like 3 acts of human drama. It is a rise from oppression through reassessment to conscious fight. All features of the third movement, as we can see, represent a complete reinterpretation of what the first part was about. A gradual and convincing reinterpretation on both a logical and emotional level. Ludwig van Beethoven, a man who lived 200 years ago, and it feels as if he is our contemporary. He speaks to us through the language of music, honestly, sincerely, boldly, without any conventions, on a level of openness that is close and understandable to us. Beethoven's music resonates deeply with people today. Through the language of emotional intelligence, he speaks about emerging from a state of depression, about finding meaning in life again, about the sense of human dignity. And now, in conclusion of our story, I would like to show you how Sonata number 14 continues to fulfill its great mission of support and salvation in our 21st century. I am now speaking about a specific example, a specific case, the story of a teenager who, practically without a family, found himself in a shelter but did not disappear or lose hope. On the contrary, he became a winner of a popular French talent show. The recording of his performance, published a year ago, has already garnered over 1 million views. Thank you, Ludwig van Beethoven.
Ça fait 8 ans que je fais cette émission, il n'y a jamais eu un applaudissement aussi long pour aucun artiste depuis 8 ans et je pense que ça fait 17 ans que cette émission existe, il n'y a jamais eu un applaudissement aussi long. C'est pour toi, Ryan.
Merci.
Merci Ryan. Très touchant.